The R12 from ThermalRight comes in gray, black, and white. There are also RGB and ARGB versions, but is the R12 any good? Let's find out. What's up everyone, Erik here and welcome to Hardware for Gamers. For those of you new to the channel, I release new videos every week on PC cases, CPU coolers, and PC case fans. So if you end up liking this video, could you please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel? It does help out a lot. Now as always, I will have timestamps in the description so you can jump to whatever interests you. But as always, I do recommend you watch the whole review. Now before I get into this review, just to have full disclosure, ThermalRight did send me over this fan, as well as some other fans and coolers to review. But as always, all the opinions expressed in this video are mine. I'm going to start off with a very quick overview of ThermalRight's R series. There is only one model of fan in the R series, the R12. This model has multiple color options, as I said in the intro, as well as an ARGB and RGB option. The RGB and ARGB options use the gray frame with a semi-transparent blade. The fan I tested is the TLR12-W. It has a rated max RPM of 1500. It has a 7-fin design. It is a fluid dynamic bearing. It has a PWM 4-pin fan connector. It has a 3-year warranty and has an MSRP of $1070 USD, and this is off of Amazon.com. Before I get into the results of my testing, I wanted to be very clear. All this testing is based off of a sample size of 1, so this isn't necessarily the exact performance you'll get, but it will be pretty close. So starting off with the PWM range test, at 100% PWM, the R12 has an RPM of 1560, and when I drop the PWM down to 0, the R12 has an RPM of 325. So this fan has a good RPM range. Okay, moving on to the standardized testing. If you have any questions on how I test the fans, please check my fan testing methodology video. There'll be a card along the top. I'll also have it linked down in the description, and that should answer most of your questions. Starting off with the dBA and RPM testing. At 4 volts, the R12 had a dBA of 32.1. and an RPM of 755. At 6 volts, it had a sound level of 32.6 dBA and an RPM of 1020. At 8 volts, the dBA went up to 34.7 and the RPM was at 1240. At 10 volts, it went up to 38.2 dBA and the RPM went up to 1425. And at 12 volts, the dBA was at 41.3 with an RPM of 1590. Now for the sound recordings at each of these voltages. Now on to the airflow testing. I left the dBA numbers up on the chart for your reference. At 4 volts with no obstructions, it had an FPM of 190. With the meshed panel, it had an FPM of 165. And with the covered panel, it had an FPM of only 48. Jumping up to 12 volts. With no obstructions, it had an FPM of 465. With the meshed panel, it had an FPM of 425. And with the covered panel, it had an FPM of 175. Moving on to the CPU cooling performance. At 4 volts, the CPU was at 82.3 C. At 6 volts, it was at 78.1 C. At 8 volts, it was at 76.5 C. At 10 volts, it was at 75.2 C. And at 12 volts, it was at 74.6 C. Okay, moving right along to the comparisons. I'll be comparing the ThermalRight R12 to the Arctic F12 PWM PST, the Up Here NT 120-44, and the Be Quiet Pure Wings 2 High Speed. In the dBA chart, when comparing the R12 to these other fans, it has a pretty similar dBA to the Up Here and Be Quiet fan, but as you can see, the Arctic F12 is a fair bit quieter at 10 and 12 volts. Now for the airflow, With no obstructions, the R12 does move a good amount of air at the lower voltages when compared to these other fans. But as you can see on the chart, the Arctic and Be Quiet fans do catch up by 12 volts. Now when comparing these fans in the meshed panel testing, things don't really change. The R12 moves a good amount of air at 4, 6, and 8 volts. But again, the Arctic and Be Quiet fans do catch up by 12 volts. In the covered panel testing, things do change quite a bit. There is a large FPM drop across all the fans. The R12 manages to perform pretty well at 4 volts when compared to these other fans, but the R12's FPM starts to quickly drop off after 6 volts, meaning it's not ideal to use behind a solid panel. Moving on to the CPU cooling test, at 8, 10, and 12 volts, all these fans perform well, which is to be expected, but the R12 does manage to outperform the F12 and the PureWings 2 at 4 and 6 volts. Okay, moving on to the 34 dBA testing. So I have all the fans noise equalized to 34 dBA or 12 volts if they don't reach 34 dBA. With no obstructions, the R12 lands in the middle of the chart with an FPM of 335. With a meshed panel and noise equalized to 34 dBA, the R12 is again in the middle of the chart with an FPM of 300. And finally, with the covered panel, the R12 is again in the middle of the chart with an FPM of 110. So what do I think of the ThermalRight R12? It's an okay fan at a good price with a 3-year warranty. In my testing, this fan was able to move more air at a similar dBA of the other fans, but only at the lower voltages. It loses this edge as the voltage, i.e. the RPM, increases. The optimal RPM is around 1100 to 1200 RPM, and this has something to do with the design of the blades on the fan. It just works better at lower RPM. The R12 would be best placed where airflow is not restricted, like at a rear exhaust or behind a meshed front panel. I would not recommend the R12 as a front intake fan in a case with a solid front panel. It just doesn't have the static pressure. It is nice that ThermalRight does offer an RGB and ARGB option, as well as the 3 color options. Okay, to wrap this up, the R12 is an okay fan. It's certainly not a bad fan, but it's also not the best fan. Now, if you already have an R12 or you're wanting to buy an R12, you'll just want to make sure your system has enough airflow to keep the R12 in around 1100 RPM, because that's where it's at its best. Well, that's all I got for this one. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you're still watching, maybe hit the subscribe button and the bell icon so you get notified whenever I drop a new video. Please follow me on Twitter at HFG_YT. There's an HFG Discord server. All the charts that were in this video are up on the HFG Discord server, but you will need to become a member to actually see them, but it is completely free to join. All you have to do is agree to the server rules. You may want to also check out these videos here. They should be along the same lines of what you just watched. And as always, thank you for watching, and see you next time.